Everybody, welcome to the Making of Mummy the Curse panel. I am Eddy Webb. I am a content designer for CCP. Could you guys introduce yourself to my right?
Hi, Colin. I'm the mummy developer.
He actually is a mummy act. That's not his title. There's a lot of drinking last night.
A lot of drinking. Well, you know, this would not have been when I would have scheduled a WAD panel if it was entirely up to me. All right.
I'm Matt. I run Drive-Thru RPG, so I'll be where you get your books eventually.
I'm Dave. I'm one of the writers.
And our creative director, Rich Thomas, will be showing up at some point in the future. He's stuck at Starbucks right now, so I don't know how. So, I can start a little bit into the background and history of how it started. Last year, Rich and I were both at CCP. At that time, we were building the transmedia division. We were trying to make sure that there was somebody inside of CCP that was full-time paying attention to the needs of the original White Wolf products and properties. So, making sure that the New World Darkness was getting support, that the that's fun. Making sure that the suddenly growing Classic World Darkness support was also happening. And one of the things we had talked about. Rich Thomas, everybody.
Hey guys.
Oh, you get applause for being late.
Well, now that it's starting to become now a learned behavior now.
Yeah, so see, exactly.
I can only be late.
You've been encouraged. I'll have to beat you with the paper later. So one of the things that we Rich and I both talked about is that we wanted to make sure we did a new game line release for New World Darkness. Because we are in a new business model, though, it wasn't because, hey, it's next year and we have to roll out a new game because that's how we make money and continue to pay our checks and our mortgages. Now it's more along the lines of this is the right time to do a new game, and Rich and I are both pretty set on the idea that it needs to be a game that we had done the Classic World Darkness in a very new direction. And so we kicked around Demon and Mummy, I think, about the same time, and ultimately you settled on Mummy.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I settled on Mummy because Eddy did such a good job talking about the cool things that are about Mummy, and not just the 3 incarnations we did previously, but on a very, let's bring it back to its roots, let's see what's really cool about this, the gothic nature of these guys in pith helmets exploring tombs that discover on things that should not have been discovered, and now they walk again, sort of thing. So that sounded really good, and particularly coming back into it after having had a year off, and after having done Geist, which, as you know, we kind of didn't feel like we did as fully as we could have. Mummy just really made a lot of sense. But as these things often are, it was the energy of the people speaking about it that kind of at least swayed me.
Right, and
I don't think there would have been a wrong answer. I think if we said Demon or we said Creature of the Black Lagoon, it still would have been great to do a game at this time.
And to be fair, and that was something that when we first talked about it, is one of the things I liked about the New World Darkness interpretations of the products is that it was an attempt to kind of get back to some of the classic movie monster vibe, but in a very modern and approachable setting. And so, like, especially Forsaken, it very much gets back to some of the movie monster werewolves, and Mages gets into kind of the mythic elements of Magi. And Changeling goes to the Grimm's Fairy Tales interpretation of changelings. So as one thing, I was like, there's a lot of that movie mummy aesthetic that hadn't really quite hit in the previous interpretations, which are still great, but it was very much set in the Classic World Darkness meta plot and not that kind of more archetypal mummy thing.
And not just the movie ones, but also where you were in Bram Stoker.
And that's just where the idea came from, is that Bram Stoker actually wrote the first Mummy story. There's some debate about whether that's actually true, but everyone believes that's true, so we'll go with that. But it was like, hey, Bram Stoker wrote other stuff besides vampires. He wrote mummies as well, and so reading through that, and it's like it has all of the checkpoints that we recognize now. There's a curse, and there's an ancient family who studies Egyptology, and something horrible happens. And there's an object that is very that the mummy's very obsessed about and gets very involved with. So a lot of that kind of came together in my initial pitch. And
one of the reasons we look at those things isn't because, hey, let's rip off the monster movie. These are real, these things work because they're touching something in us, in the kind of the myth structure that's inside our heads, right? So when Eddy brings up all those things that hey, that's pretty cool, that's cool, it's because we're through whatever medium we're getting these things through. If all you did was read books about mummies, then there would be something in there where you go, oh, yeah, that works for me. If all you watched was all black and white movies, or all you watched was Brendan Fraser's mummies, there's stuff in there that is like touch points in our big, our brains really. My brain's not working today.
Right. And so we talked about. This is not working. So they're cool pictures. I'll show you in a second here. Let's put right here so you guys can kind of see it, sort of maybe. So we came up with a pitch that we both kind of liked, and Rich and I decided that we were going to go ahead and start talking about it at GenCon. Now, step back a bit. During this time, I had also gotten a separate pitch from Colin. And it was in my inbox, and I was like, at the time, I was like, yeah, there's some cool bits here, but I wasn't quite seeing Colin's vision completely. And so I was like, I think we want to try a different direction with stuff. So we were so rushed, kind of getting things ready because we want to talk about it at Gen Con. And I get a call back from Colin. It's like, going, hey, Mummy, so what's up? And we had
That's exactly what I said.
more or less, I mean, paraphrasing, it was much more eloquent than I was much less drunk at the time. We started actually talking about the pitch, because the problem, the downsides of a pitch is that it's so short, sometimes you can't get a lot of nuances of the idea in there. It's meant to be a short, concise thing, kind of go yes, no. And as we started talking through on the phone and going through my ideas we come up with versus what Colin had originally kind of pitched us, I realized there's a lot more similarities than I had first realized. And so I was like, you know what? Let's go ahead and pull this back up. And I put it in front of Rich, pulling out points saying, this is where it ties to this thing you and I talked about. This ties to this thing you and I talked about. And so pretty quickly we knew we wanted Colin on board to be involved with that early development. Unfortunately, as time went on, with everything happening in CCP, I had to move full-time to MMO, and I couldn't do the due diligence on maintaining the game that I had hoped for. And so I was like, you know what? Colin's got a really strong vision. He's bringing a lot of great flavor and ideas to it that went way beyond the stuff that we're going to be talking about. And so I just kind of, gave my blessing and handed it off. It's like, you know what, Colin, you go ahead and develop the line, because you really get where I originally kind of saw in that, and actually brought a whole bunch of new stuff that I was just blown away by, going, this is really amazing. I hadn't even considered, and this is a really cool add-on and update to the original idea. So, at that point...
Hello. So, I didn't really have a whole lot prepared, but I'm prepared to answer all kinds of questions and spoil a couple of things. But yeah, the short version is, I don't know if you guys remember Mummy the Resurrection, but I was a developer on that too. And that was fun, but that was maybe, it was one of the last two games in the old continuity. And so it was super meta plot heavy. And it was cool, it was time and it added to that game. But it was pretty constricting in terms of what kind of character you could play. It's a very specific narrative. There's one little group. You had to go there to become one. It was this whole thing. And in the new game, I knew I wanted it to be kind of the opposite of that. Like Rich was saying, a bit more drawn on the classic archetype. All the new WoD games are this, return to Gothic form. And that was one thing that was mostly missing from the last version of Mummy. So that flavor, that idea, that archetype, that was the core of it. And it grew. Another thing I knew I wanted to do is something that hadn't been seen since the early 90s, really, which is a return to the idea of a split between what the guy behind the screen or the girl behind the screen knows and can prepare for the players, and what the players know in their characters. That's always a risky thing to do in terms of print, or at least it was conventionally, because
Right.
you don't want somebody paying for half the content of a book but paying the whole price for it. And so we started talking about what we could do in terms of new approach, this virtual box set idea came in, and I said, well, it'd be really cool if, you give people the option of buying all the content. Storyteller's going to have all of it. Or players just buying the player-focused stuff if they didn't want all of it. And so what you have is a division where there's a player book, it's about half the core content, and a storyteller book, it's about the other half. Hello. And that was a theme that I wanted to carry through the line for however long it lived. And
now we can do that the way, of course, with publishing now, where we can sell you 2 PDFs, depending on which one you want, or it's a combined thing, get the whole thing and you're happy. And then same thing with the print on demand, just what version do you really want to do that? And so that sort of was how the virtual box set came together of, remember box sets where there's a couple books in there and and it could be an adventure and then you just buy it all together, in virtual form. We were talking early on about a dice roller for it, because we thought that would be kind of cool. It would replicate when you got a box set and there was dice in it. That will eventually happen with Mummy. But the dice roller itself, trying to get that app up and rolling and working with people to do that took a little longer. And, at the state that we're waiting for Mummy to come together, maybe it'll be out with it. I don't know. But not to, it's all on getting the actual book laid out right now. So anyway, okay.
that's probably the first thing that we can spoil is, when is it coming out?
Soon.
Okay. I thought we could spoil it. Soon.
Yeah, so we should be able to look at the first proof of the layout, which would be a relatively tight version of it. It should have everything that we have in it. The art's all but one piece has been approved. It's cool. That just has to get dropped in and pulled together. So. Would love to be able to give an actual date. If I say anything, damn well it's going to go later than that. So, but September's definitely what we're going for.
But I think September-ish is going to be out.
Right. It's more of a concept than a due date.
Right. The idea of September.
But that's for
Late
us.
soon.
That's soon, within the next month, something. Around there. So another thing I knew I wanted to do is take the in the last game, for example, part of your character background was your first life, and that was only background. That added fluid development to your character, but it wasn't really part of it, and it wasn't a dynamic part of your character. And so I said, well, one thing would be cool if you got creatures that part of their whole thing is that they're immortal. What about getting to play in the time that they've been alive, instead of just now? And it's a little tricky because talking about New World of Darkness, and it's a very coherent tone, and a lot of it's very contemporary, and how can you maintain that if you're playing a game set in 1712 or whatever? But I knew I wanted the option in there. So it is. So now when you play your character, if your storyteller decides to do a flashback type thing, you can run a whole story and an arc that is completely coherent in your character in that story. But you get to play in a completely different atmosphere and still have it be the new WAD. That's a hard thing to contain within a single game and still have it work, but it does, I think. And so the other main thing, and this is some of the stuff that Eddy and I were really excited about early on, but like he said, there's a lot to the game. Its core concepts are designed sort of multi-tiered, and at the same time, you can't get that across in the 2-page pitch. It just doesn't. Mm-hmm. And there's some mechanics innovations here, which is sort of, you don't want to get carried away. If you guys were here yesterday for the Onyx Path White Wolf panels, we were talking about the God Machine and some other things that we're doing, and how it's just sort of a New World of Darkness / Storyteller 2.0, but not really. Well, this kind of goes hand in hand with that. We hadn't done a new WAD game since Geist, and as Eddy was saying yesterday, the first shot at that wasn't exactly perfect, and that's why we got it 1.1 or whatever we're calling it.
Right.
And so I wanted a little bit of like the development of that idea. How does the storyteller system had been fairly consistent since '04 when Vampire the Requiem came out. A lot of interesting things done in the supplements of the games that followed, but basically the same engine. It's the storytelling system, new WAD. And I said, well, we need to put a little bit of new game into the game. This seems like the perfect idea because you've got as much time to work with as you need. You've got these heavy themes to work with. You can divide player and character knowledge. And then there's the nature of the mummy, its existence itself. I said, that should be part of the game. And so there are a few things that we're going to do here. And we spoiled a couple of them on the blog. I don't know if you guys have been following the blog. But I started that up.
If not, you should.
I think, May we got it kicked off?
Yeah.
April, something like that. And yeah, more or less every week. And so some of those things you might have been hearing.
And that's one thing definitely, kind of reiterating that point is in both of our pitches, we were both very adamant on mechanics reflects behavior, and we were both felt very strongly that while the core World Darkness system is very, very solid, it needs to adjust to encourage a kind of play style that'll be unique to a mummy. And in some respects, it's very, very different from a lot of it because there's brief bursts of activity and long bits of death/sleeplessness versus other things. And so that's something we both were keyed on right away was like, okay, what can we do to adjust the system in ways that make sense, but also encourage me to play more like a mummy rather than playing like a human who happens to have a template slapped on.
Yep, and that's actually a great point. All right, since I was one of the guys who wrote Vampire the Requiem, I can speak critically of it. And one of the ways that we tried to do that, and it's the first WAD game, remember, so sort of in its infancy. It was being developed concurrently to the new WAD, the core book, so there's a lot of what, and then back and forth. And one of the ways we tried to do that is the Predator's Taint mechanic for Vampire, and that is, notorious.
I think every panel's going to mention that at this point.
Well,
It's funny to watch Rich twitch.
yeah.
It's really true.
It's a good example of a way that the design reflects the creature, and these games are about those beings and being inside their heads, but not an entirely successful one for everyone. There were some problems with the implementation for some people. Rich, for example, Twitch, has a problem with taking player choice away, even to a minor extent when it comes to things that are very essential, such as one vampire meets another one in the story. It's probably going to happen. And so,
In a vampire game, but yeah.
About
And-
social beings.
we did it again in Promethean. There's aspects to that creature's existence that are perfectly reflective of what it's supposed to be about, but how conducive are those to gameplay and how they were implemented? Well, some people say it's perfect, others say it's a little harmful to group play, or, there's these. So
I can't play Prometheans because every time they sit still, they wreck everything around them.
Yeah. Yep.
Insert RPG net here.
Forcing a nomadic lifestyle onto a creature is one thing, but they're supposed to be working in groups, and so it gets hard to write around, basically. And even if you can, your players are still kind of bottlenecked. They want to play here and then they have to go there. So I wanted to avoid a little of that if I could, and leave more options rather than less, but still give definition. So the curse is the name of the game, and it's one thing people have asked about on the blog more and more over the past few weeks. I'm not going to tell you what it is. Sorry.
You did say spoil some things, not all things.
However,
Not a spoiler.
it's absolutely in the game, and that's not just you got to buy it, or but
For me, it's
yes, it is. When you read it, you'll if you read it, you'll get it. What was another thing? Oh, so in terms of modeling, behavior, that's sort of what the design is about. You take the creature or the idea, and then you build game around it. And there's a lot of different ideas you can use, but what's the right one? And how strong is it? And how much does it reflect, your philosophy and what you're trying to do? and decided one of the main things we want to do is we're going to try out this system, and it's in the core thing, and hopefully we're going to be able to use it moving forward and other things. But they're called frameworks, and one of the things you might have interacted with in the old other games, or even in the old WOD, is what about let's say you've got 5 friends. Some people say there's an optimum number to storyteller/WOD games. Some people say it's not, but the point is you're talking about 3 to 6 or 7 sort of as the optimum. It's kind of hard to write a story, and there's storytelling games, where you've got 6 or 7, let's say, Prometheans who all have a reason to be together and to play, and that wasn't addressed very well in the core book. It was sort of touched on in one of the supplements.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I said, well, rather than shoehorn a way to make everyone play the same thing in a group when you're talking about very individuated creatures, think about how much personality and individuality you could develop after 6,000 years. I mean, you might think of yourself as a pretty three-dimensional and unique person after 30, 35, 40, I mean, 6,000 years. So it's built into the game that you don't have to do that. There are sort of substructures. So, for example, one of the core frameworks is called the pyramid. Yeah. And
Mummies.
And
Go figure.
And in the pyramid framework, which, I think it's presented in the core material as sort of the default assumption, and another way it's not, but it's called that because you've got a character at the top who is the mummy. The default assumption in the game, although not everyone has to have one, is that you have a cult, minions, right? And it's a core element. I think in the Writer's Bible, I described it as being this game sort of analog to one of those derivative game elements in the other games. So bloodlines, lodges, legacies, whatever, for the other games. Cults, that's what mummies get. You can personalize it. I worked with Greg Stolze, who is a madman, on how to make a cult an individual experience in a storytelling game without being bogged down in rules or taking away from the story. So if it's your cult, it has to serve you and it can't hijack the narrative. And that was sort of the mission statement. Another thing from the Writer's Bible, and this is something that kind of crystallized for Eddy when he was looking through it, which is if your character has a problem recollecting everything about his own experience, well, that's fodder, right? It's not just fodder for a particular story, it's fodder for theme. And so the principal theme in Mummy is memory. It's also a game tree. And there's a bit of the line that I used in the Writer's Bible is, you think of a mummy as the photo negative of a vampire. Eddy touched on this a minute ago.
Yep.
The default assumption when you're playing a vampire, which is, our flagship line when you think of Storyteller and World of Darkness games, I'm playing a vampire. It's the opposite of that. With vampires, they're assumed to be active and awake with these short, focused periods of inactivity. They get beaten into torpor, or they've got to bleed off some blood potency or whatever. The default state of being for a mummy is death. Someone calls you up, what are you doing? I'm dead. But for short...
But I'll get better.
I'm getting better. But for short, focused periods, they're active. Now, short is subject to...
How much time you need to play.
Yeah, basically. And so the entire game experience for playing Mummy has actually been deconstructed and plotted out. This principal thing, it's not a theme, but it's a huge part of the game, is called the Descent. And it's one of the chief, I guess, meta mechanics of the game. The entire experience of being active is built into the game, because the assumption is that you're not. So as soon as you arise, whether it's because your tomb has been disturbed and you're pissed, or because your cult has called you back because something important needs to be done, that's the start of a clock. This has not been done in a World of Darkness game for obvious reasons. It could create headaches and so forth, but this game, it just sort of jumps in with both feet. And as soon as you arise, time is against you, which is the great irony of a mummy's existence, because it's all he's got. It's time. But he doesn't have to worry about death. And in fact, the name for all mummies in the game is the Deathless. And one of the guys posted on the blog after that was revealed, and he said, is it like deathless, or is it like kind of deathless?
It's 10% deathless.
I know your spectrum of deathlessness.
Yeah. I said, isn't that like being a little pregnant? So yeah, they are immortal. It's very similar to the old game in terms of the nature of the beast. A mummy, what has to be standing ground zero at the detonation of a thermonuclear explosion for him to even have to worry about, well, I might not have a body to come back to. You know what I mean? That's not the point. The point is not, I have to worry about being killed by my enemies. The point is everything else. The point is, why am I here? The point is, how much time do I have to do it? The point is, how much of my agenda or motives or goals do I have to sacrifice for whatever reason? How much is it about my cult? How important are they to me? The range of personality is the entire spectrum. It's taking choice out of your hands is not something we wanted to do. So you're not pigeonholed into being a particular morality if you're a mummy. There are certain things that imply morality or a mindset of it, but they're not really legislated into the game. So just like vampires, or how it's supposed to be when you're playing it, a given one can be really, really inhuman. After 6,000 years, he's decided, I don't really have anything in common with these people. Those are the ones, if you're one of their cultists, you're probably not having a very good time. I have to do what? That's awesome. And then you've got the whole spectrum. And so on the other end, you've got mummies who have had 6,000 years to learn human compassion, failings, ideals. These are guys who are around when the Platonic ideal was developed. You could have been sitting there having chats with the guy. I mean, when you think about the scope of it, they could be pretty ascended beings. And some of their cults view them that way. One of the things we teased on the blog a few weeks ago is that cult system. And you get to pick. Is it like a corporate structure? Is it like a gang thing? The default assumption is that it's tribal because it's been so long that that's sort of the origination, because there were tribes before there were corporations. And that gives you the freedom to define the flavor of your experience. So if you want to be, the head of a secret conspiracy or something, and you pay your cultists, like, you can work it that way. Dave. Say hi, Dave.
Hi.
Dave did something I have not seen in 15 years, which is when he came on the project, he was one of the newer guys, and I picked him up from Mage because there are a lot of thematic tie-ins. Mage is a really cool game, but thankfully it left some room narratively and thematically for another game that was sort of magic focused, because Mage was very specifically about Atlantean magic and the background in its story. And so I was like, oh cool, I've got a little niche I can work in.
Some white space.
Yeah. And he says to me, I really, really want to write the storytelling chapter. And I said, come again? I've had to write a couple of those. Most people are not like, right at, there at the beginning waiting for the doors to open. But he loved the possibilities and the themes. He saw all that stuff and he said, wow, memory and responsibility and like, this is what like storytelling games should kind of be about. So, and he did a really good job with that. You guys will see.
He did.
But in other games that stuff it's not hand waved, but it seems to be hand waved by the readers. And we tried to make it really to drive home the point that, especially in the New World of Darkness, where the flavor like the tone is so delicate that if you shatter that, it's very hard to tell a story. The classic World of Darkness is a little bit more broad,
forgiving.
Like, yeah, you can put different disparate elements in, and a good group of people will make it work. It'll still be fun. It'll still be coherent. If you break flavor in the new WAD, you know, you're looking at the Mona Lisa and suddenly she's got a Pikachu on her shoulder. It doesn't work. It's like so. The consistency of tone is very important to me, and I spent a lot of time and oxygen with my team when I brought them on, saying, "This is the game we're in, so everybody needs to be on that page, and the rest will kind of follow." And Dave was really into that. Another thing about Dave, in the core, the box set, the virtual box set, player book, storyteller book, and starting adventure. Something else we haven't done in the other new WAD games that had to come sort of separate. And so when you buy the core thing, you get that just to begin with right off the bat, so you can kind of know how to run this. Dave wrote that. That is set in Rio, yes, Brazil.
By the CO.
Yes, but it can be plucked out and put in any major urban environment. He did a good job capturing some of the flavor, but it's not that hard to plug and play. Speaking of spoilers, some people are asking, well, every WAD game has had a default as a signature setting, and part of the idea was you release that like immediately and get people some context, you know, sort of your case study. Well, I'm happy to relate, in case anyone hadn't already figured it out by now based on the teasing in the blog post. The signature setting for Mummy is Washington, D.C. For reasons that will be obvious when you're reading the game. And because no one had done it yet. Now, personally, I actually live in Washington, D.C., and, I mean, aside from all the obvious stuff, you know, the Masons and, like, the sort of weird sacred geometry of the town, it's perfect for the theme of the game, but you guys can spread that far and wide.
A little bit of that's in Falling Scales Part 2.
Is it?
It's set in
Say that louder.
Falling Scales Part 2 is also set in DC, and Monica was teasing that Mummy's on the way. So
Oh, cool.
Kind of get a
Yeah.
little.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
There was a
She
plan.
was reading your blog. And,
Oh, that's cool.
So we got about 20 minutes left. Do you want to go to questions?
Sure.
So one of the more traditional settings for Mummy is like Cairo.
yeah, he wrote.
Was that a question? Or?
Yeah, so why not a more traditional setting like Cairo?
Oh, okay, cool. Well, it's funny. I wrote a book called Cairo by Night, and that was for vampire, and the elements in there that are not specific to vampires revolved around mummies, and that was a big Final Nights metaplot book. It was right before. It was actually the same. It was the vampire offering to that banner, that theme, when the old Mummy came out. And I remember asking Justin if I could put other things in to make it all coherent, and he said, "No, this game's called Vampire."
Bitch.
I said,
That's just what he was saying.
I said, well, all right, but just remember, the first Mummy was technically a supplement for Vampire, so that part, I could use like, yes, that you're allowed. So there's two things to that question. The first is, not only did we already do it, I personally already did it. I lived in Cairo for a while. Sometimes the low-hanging fruit is just too easy, you know? And now, there's cool things we can do, and in fact, Cairo, you know, you can do a lot of things with it. It's the largest city in all of Africa and the Middle East. It's in the World of Darkness. It's even bigger and stinkier. And, but so what I wanted to do was to illustrate the diaspora, basically. These are they're people who kind of became creatures who predate all of the real civilization as we know it. So yes, there's a sort of Egyptian flavor, or proto-Egyptian flavor, but ultimately what difference? The distinction, you're talking about creatures that are like, you know, they predate agriculture. What do they care about, you know? So without removing that central element of its flavor, because everyone associates it with that, you don't need to hang a lantern on it also by saying, and now we're going to put it in Cairo, you know? So it's a lot more interesting to say, these beings ended up in the New World. That's how we have mummies in D.C. And for those of you who are passingly familiar with the history of Brazil, there's a lot of parallels. The Europeans came. I remember when Dave was doing his homework for the SAS, he was pretty excited about the story possibilities, and I was like, so I kind of wanted to illustrate the idea that you've got an old world sensibility, like the oldest old world sensibility, and how to put that in that context without at the same time betraying what we'd always done, which is giving Americans something concrete they can hold on to. If you're playing Changeling, does your game have to be in Miami? No. And in fact, I know a guy who ran an awesome Changeling game that was just all Serbia and Croatia. So what you have is another newish thing that we're doing with this is sort of a, you know, the new day 2.0 sort of philosophy is there's one of each. You can consider Rio the international signature setting, but DC is the American one. Does that stop you from running a mummy game in Cairo? Of course not. But that it almost writes itself. Question? Anyone else? Yes.
What is the actual cause that creates the character to be a mummy in the game?
Okay. That is called the right of return. It's according to the philosophy or the meta plot in the game, the internal consistency. It's the mightiest feat of magic ever performed by mortals on the planet. And it's gone. It's a finite thing. The amount of mummies that there are in the world is it. It has to be because they don't die, right? So this is the total number, and when one does disappear from the earth, it is a monumental event. They can't replicate. There's no embracing. There's no, I'm bored. I'm going to create a bunch more mummies. Well, that would dilute the whole thing. So it makes their existence interestingly tenuous. The rite was performed on a select group of people in the backstory of the game, similar to how the birth of, you know, mage magic was Atlantis and so forth. In the case of Mummy, it is this sort of proto-Egypt. What we're implying in the game is that in the World of Darkness continuity, the civilization that created mummies also planted the seeds and gave rise to what became the Old Kingdom, because that was only 2,800 years ago, 2,800 years BC. So this is like 1,400 years before that, was this civilization. In the game, it's called the Nameless Empire because nobody can remember anything about what it was called, and that's one of the mysteries in the game. But they know that its capital, the Rome of its day, was Irem. And Irem obviously has some baggage. It has some significance, just like Atlantis has significance. A little less loaded, but... And so, you know, I use that on purpose. And it evokes a lot of things that are key to the feel of the game, including the fact that it's gone. But that's the answer to your question. In this long-gone city-state that was the center of the Nameless Empire, Irem, the City of Pillars, the Rite of Return was performed on the various peoples who lived there. The world was divided into 4 groups at the time: Egyptians, Asiatics, Libyans, and Nubians. And these are pretty broad groups as defined by contemporary archaeology and anthropology. But generally speaking, you could be from any one of those and have been a mummy. So you could be male, you could be female, you could be very dark-skinned. Here's another thing that I'll spoil. The opening fiction for the core book, and that's a storied tradition in White Wolf games, and I assigned that to Greg Stolze for obvious reasons if you know his work. And it features the awakening of one of these, the main characters, which is a type of mummy in the game called the arisen. And it features the awakening of one of these arisen. And once all the bandages come off and stuff, you realize he's very, very dark-skinned. He's one of the Nubian people who was subjected to the rite. But his cult is a bunch of Inuits. So it's all this wintry landscape stuff and, you know, all these like Eskimos running around and then big dark-skinned dead guy. So,
Nice contrast.
Exactly.
Okay, go get to the other panel.
All right, man.
Thanks, man.
Anyone else? That's a good question.
I'm a history teacher, and one of the things I like to look at when I see new role-playing books is their potential for use in the classroom. I'm
Yes.
wondering if there's any tie-ins with any other mummies from around the world, like with the Inca or anything like that, for example.
Is that going to work? Are we going to be able to see the art, or is it just?
I'm playing it,
It's
but I mean,
It's we.
I know. I know it's not going to work. Is your
Okay,
answer.
all right. Well, we've got some banging art for this game. Very happy with how a lot of it's turned out. I teased some of it in the most recent blog post, but that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface. That doesn't include any of the big full pagers that people have come to associate with our stuff. It's really cool looking. But what was the question? Oh, yeah. So part of the problem, Eddy and I discussed this early on, actually.
Yeah, we did.
Part of the point in the new imaginings, when you're going to do an archetype again, especially if it's a big, heavy, like 180 reconceptualization, we didn't want to repeat ourselves as sort of 101. The first thing, before we even know what it's going to be, we know what we don't want it to be, which is redundant. In Mummy the Resurrection, a lot of attention was paid, and then even more when, like the supplements, like the Mummy Player's Guide, most of that was focused on, well, okay, we know what the core is, which is the meta plot mummies and the spell of life people. What about the South American mummies? What about the Far East, Chinese mummies and their terracotta armies of warriors? And so, in short, he didn't want to do it again. But the specific background of this, and it coming from this civilization that I basically created, allows for that. Now, it's not to say that those traditions are sort of debunked in the continuity of the game, but what traditions they have are not the right of return. They don't create a mummy as the game defines it. They have sorcery and stuff, but in actuality in this game, if you encounter a real mummy in, let's say, the Andes or something, it's one of these guys. And before you say, well, I mean, that's kind of, you're dropping someone else's culture. It's not really someone else's culture. They're only Egyptian in the sense that they came from the part of the world that eventually became Egypt.
Right, because another thing we actually talked about is, because originally my idea was I wanted to have more of that, but then we started talking through, what kind of clicked in my head was that what's really happening is even the Egyptian mummies that we understand now are a pale shadow of this former culture. So all of the other mummies, the Incan, Chinese mummies, whatnot, are all trying to replicate this thing that no longer exists, either consciously or subconsciously. So there's only one kind of mummy, but those mummies influence the entire ancient world. So you could do both, which I thought was a very, very subtle and engaging way of doing it, rather than the classic world darkness of checkbox, 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 which we did previously.
And that's something I wanted to avoid is the idea of the slotted cultural place. Well, it's a very classic WAD idea.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to do that again. Yes, there are sort of splats in this, but they're internal. They come from what you would expect from this being the backstory and what they're about. And it's not, well, those are the Russian mummies and those are the...
I do recommend checking out the Mummy Player's Guide from Resurrection, if you're curious about what he did on those cultures. It's not, of course, for the new game, but it's really good, solid work.
And another interesting thing on the historical perspective front is, as you saw when we put the schedule up, there's this book Eddy doesn't know how to pronounce, called Southwest Ascents, and it's sort of the final exam for the line unless crazy things happen. It's going to be the capstone of the arc that we're telling through the supplements, and a big part of what it's going to address is how to play historical Mummy. Now some people say, well, you're going to wait till later on to do that. I wanted to do that immediately and say, well, sorry, it's the realities of publishing, but it is going to get done. And one of the things it's going to address is not just how to run those games, historical or flashback games, but specific attention paid to these periods when all mummies wake up and run around and do stuff. And this is based on what's called the Sothic cycle, which is every 1400 years or so. Sothis, which is the star Sirius, which plays a huge role in ancient Egyptian magic and all this stuff. It comes full circle. And when that happens, and it's happened 4 times since the Arisen were created, they don't have to be disturbed, they don't have to be summoned, nothing crazy. The default state of being reverses, and they all get up, and they all have something they need to do, and they go do it. And so this book is going to address how to run extended chronicles within those periods because you have the time. And I forget what they are, but it was designed so that we could capitalize on right now being an important part. So it's a cusp thing. So 2012, including all the Mayan calendar nonsense, like it's, so right now in the modern of the game, 2012, 2013 is one of those periods. It's one of the turns. So you have the excuse to put more mummies into play if you want. You go back 1400 years. So what is that? The year?
Back 1400 years.
600. Yeah.
600 AD, around the.
Which is cool because that is just before the rise of Islam, and
Around the
which is
invasion
7th
of Egypt.
century. So, and then you go 1400 years before that, and so it's an opportunity to basically do era role playing with them. You can do it just before Islam in that context, and then you can do it in
U Kingdom, and then the one before that's the
right
Old Kingdom.
800 BC, right, which is before Cleopatra.
And the other thing I thought was actually clever about that when we first talked about it was that we've slowly been working in some historical references in the other World of Darkness games, but none of them really go below like around the 6th century. So basically, there's an explanation as to why none of the other races have even heard of these guys is because all of the history that kind of have pieced together in the past 1400 years is gone, and only people who have even remotely ancient history are the mages, and most of that is half of it's made up, by them. So, really most of the World Darkness races have never heard of these creatures, and then suddenly just appear. They don't really have a context for them, which I found really fascinating. Is that from the perception of mages and vampires, these things just show up, which I think is really really cool.
What do mummies do?
It's a good question. Eddy mentioned something cool a minute ago. It's very relevant. A core part of the game is the idea that, like I said, it's essentially a magic game. If you want to really pull out and go meta on it, you say, well, what is the nature of this thing? And sometimes that stems from genre. Well, it's a sci-fi game, so it's about tech or whatever. Well, this is ultimately an occult horror game. So it's about their magic, the magic paradigm of the game, how they interact with it. And all mummies essentially are born of it. They wouldn't be immortal without it. They wouldn't be coming back without it. Its magic permeates everything. And the philosophy of the game distills this into the Egyptian concept of Sekhem, which is sort of life force. And that stuff isn't just there in them. It's in the rest of the world. But it's important to them. And so Eddy mentioned artifacts, baubles, things. This is where the dark pulp fantasy aspect can really come to play. Is there's a lot of MacGuffins in the world of Mummy. The Nameless Empire produced them. It's part of how it was dominant. Because if you've got an army, for example, one of the things they did was Irem had bronze before any other contemporary culture. Boom. Global dominance, you know what I mean? Like if it's 6,000 years ago and everyone else is it's not that hard to make an army that can kind of spread out. So there's a little Alexander the Great action going on. But what happens with that is you need to send the artifacts of empire to the far corners of it to ensure that it continues. You've got the provincial governors of this ancient civilization keeping order. And what happens is the relics of that entire people in that age also had a diaspora. And so, for example, in the opening fiction I referenced, it's called the 7 Times Hallowed Mask. And this Inuit tribe has this sort of shrine. It's called the Dwelling They Don't Speak Of or something, very Greg Stolze. And when it's sort of tied to their patron, right? It's his artifact, it's in his tomb, he's responsible for it. The game is exhaustively detailed on what the significance of that is, and I'm not going to spoil all of those details, but generally speaking, if someone makes off with one of those classic pulp tomb robbing sort of things, well, the mummy has to get it back. I would say that the classic default start of the archetypal mummy story is you're playing a mummy, you're dead because that's what you do, and suddenly you're awake, and you have to figure out why, and then you have to go make it right. A lot of the times, the starting story, the SAS that you're going to see, is very much about
Has a
that.
bit of a cold open. Bam, you're awake and there are people shouting at you.
Yes. Yeah. It's like having your alarm set for, 700 years, and then you get up and everyone's around you screaming and people have guns and, oh, you don't know what a gun is, you know. So the answer to your question is the story possibilities are innumerable because mummies can be motivated by everything we can be motivated by, plus all the things that they're kind of programmed to cover. They've got an instinct, kind of like vampires do. Mm-hmm. Mummies, it's not the beast or anything, but there's things that they're sort of driven to, you know, which it leads to a little of the shambling, like I may not know anything about my environment, but I know I have to go over there and kill somebody.
And the other thing that we both really liked about the idea is that most of the World of Darkness games, there's lots of like subplots and side ideas and whatnot, which are really cool and fantastic. But when you wake up as a mummy, you have a clock. I mean, you know, I got X amount of time before I'm dead again. So suddenly you have to really prioritize what you want to do. So there's a lot of things that mummies can do, but how much of it is important? And if like you start off with, well, my artifact is missing and I need to recover it, then that becomes highest priority, and then anything else you may want to do, like I need to go cook up with my friends or plot or you know, build my evil empire. But I have other stuff I need to do. And so that's where things like the cult and whatnot can really come in. It's like, you know, okay, well, maybe I need to have my NPCs or my minions take care of stuff, which again goes back to that very classic mummy thing, is they have their you know, the guy, you know, the guy in the turban goes into Casablanca and you know, tries to get things back for his master. There's reasons for doing that now because you don't have the time. You have to manage a group, and it's a very different style of play than any other World of Darkness game has done previously.
And it actually, in the core book, it pays attention to some of the realities of that. Like, you know, there's 25,000 mile diameter of the planet. If a mummy has only a short amount of time, simply getting from here to Mogadishu, well, his time's up. He doesn't, you know. So you have to kind of administrate that and work it in. Stolze did a good job in sort of structuring that part of the descent so that it doesn't like hamstring story. You don't want to feel like you're I have to take a plane, but halfway across the Atlantic I'm going to die.
So, how do groups of mummies get together? Are they like all possessed by the same cult?
That's a good question. Well, remember, they all come from the same civilization, in a lot of cases, the same town.
So they knew each other before they died.
And there's, you know, I don't want to get too much into the crossover game because part of the default assumption is that only the things mentioned in the game continuity and in the core WAD, and the only things assumed to be in the core WAD by default are people and dead people. And in Mummy, you have the things that are you need for internal consistency, which include the sort of the flow of life force and what that does. Humans who are sensitive to it, which I think the game calls sorcerers, regular people, and mummies. Like you said, yeah, a lot of them knew each other. Now, their memories are fuzzy, but that's part of the game too. Your storyteller can say, when you run into someone, that it sets something off. And there's actually a game mechanic which is similar to the Predator's Taint that isn't as restrictive to gameplay. But like the other games, there's means by which mummies can recognize each other. And in some cases, they kind of see who that person was the first life, regardless of what they look like now or what they're wearing. But the kind of the Y splat, as people like to call it, in Mummy is the guild. And in the Nameless Empire, was essentially run by these 7 mega corporations, which were guilds. That's how the entire operation was administrated. Everybody who is a mummy in the game was in one of those guilds 6,000 plus years ago. And the guilds as a splat in the game now are how these creatures have distilled the combination of their memory of that time, their programming, and their beliefs, their belief structures. And mummies of the same guild have reasons to do stuff together. Mummies of different guilds have reasons to do specific things with each other. A lot of it, I'll admit, comes down to story, because when you're talking about a game where you're not assumed to be active, well, by definition, you have to have a reason to tell a story anyway, because they're awake. Dave did a good job kind of laying some groundwork for how to put people in a position to deal with each other. And then there are the usual kind of fighting over resources stuff. You can't kill each other, so it becomes pretty complicated, and those alone create social sort of rules, dynamics. Alrighty. Oh, we're here.
Is there a colloquial nickname for the mummies? Like, in Resurrection, we had the Eventee.
Yes.
Is there any sort of...
The main characters that you're assumed to be playing, unless your storyteller says, like in Vampire, you're assumed to be playing one of these 5 covenants or unaligned. You can, if you want, play one of the kind of naughty covenants, like Belial's Brood, which is, I was really happy to have written that for Requiem because the notion of the like Satanist vampire is something I really wanted to define for the new game. That's some pretty dark stuff. If you've read that, that would have been a Black Dog book in the old days. But that was the point of it. You're not assumed to be playing a humanity-driven vampire as Vampire has defined it. But that is something you have to really decide that this is what we're going to play. In Mummy, you are playing one of the arisen, which is that assumed to be the sort of the default social structure of mummies. But there are other types of mummies, and those are going to be player options as well. They count
like the physical splats.
Yes, they count as deathless because all mummies are, but those don't count as arisen. The arisen are just the Camarilla. You know what I mean? They're just the default, like the majority, the broad body of the.
In mage terms, it's like you're assumed to be playing a pentacle mage. You can play an apostate or a seer if you want to.
Right.
Is that Celesti or Celesti? What is
Celesti.
Yes, Celesti.
Oh, it's Celesti.
So yes, the answer to that is the arisen. In fact, in the core material, how I said it's split into the storyteller book and the player book. The player half is called The Player's Guide to the Arisen. That is who you're assumed to be playing. We had another one over here.
Yeah, so you repeatedly have been saying mummies sort of are on a short time scale.
Yes.
But you said earlier that was relative.
Yes.
How can you give any
Sure.
better idea about that? I mean,
Yeah.
like, presumably mummies have to like learn a new language.
Okay.
Things.
Yep. Those are
It's all gonna
addressed.
take a lot of time.
Those things are addressed. There are 2 ways around that sort of, or not around it, but
Yeah.
ways to deal with it that are written into the core book. One of them is there are mummy powers. For example, there's one very flavorful, evocative one where as soon as you arise, one of your cultists or whatever who's around, who is a local, you use your power, you kiss them, and you get the language. Ways of kind of getting you to the next part. You don't really, it has to be a specific story idea that is the point in order for you to have the, I don't understand what you're saying. That needs to be a story you want to tell and not a barrier. So there's things in there to prevent that from being the problem. The question about how the descent works. The system is kind of 2-tiered. Time is negotiated in the storyteller system by story terms. So you've got scenes, you've got chapters, you've got stories, you've got chronicles. And so one way to reckon how the descent works is in that language. Scenes, chapters, stories. And another way is a straight timetable. You say, if you want an arbitrary one, here's what it translates to. And there are roles involved, so a given descent, if nothing else happens to kind of hasten it, could be anywhere from, a week to a year or more, depending on how the roles go. So you've got the time to tell a story.
But it's within the range of like a week to a year rather than 10 years to 50 years.
Well, you wouldn't really be able to drive home the point of being dead as a default state of being if you could be active for a really long time.
Right, and as you look at a lot of the mummy stories.
In the grand time scale of 14,000 years, 50 years is still pretty short.
It's true.
That was why I was confused.
Exactly.
Sure, but if you go back to, we talk about echoing these archetypes of fiction. If you go back to a lot of the classic mummy stories, they're all told in a very short time period, and they end with the mummy going back to being dead. So, the idea is that the mummies, we're talking really blips of time to these people. So while it may not be a flicker to them, in 50 years might be a short period of time, but the stories constantly iterate that the heroes vanquish within their time frame. So the mummy gets vanquished within months, a year, and usually for the sequels of those stories, the mummy comes back for whatever reason, and that's still around.
Just touching on that, one more thing I wanted to spoil here is I mentioned frameworks earlier. A mummy might have to go back to bed for a while, but if everyone else in the game is playing occultist, or here's another spoiler, mummies have their own version of, I guess you could call it, ghouls. It's in between ordinary cultist or whatever, and their state of being is this other thing. And so, you could have a story where the guy runs out of time and has to go back, and then he, the player, or she, plays a different character while he's sleeping. Everyone is still playing the game. It's still Mummy. It's still the world of Mummy. Mummies are still central to what you're doing, but no one is actually playing a mummy. But the game allows for that, so that you don't have to force this. Well, there's 7 people in our player group, so we're going to have 7 mummies, and they all have to be together all at the same time. That becomes hard to write around and not break the color of the game, so there's a lot in there to let you write around it.
Sure, and as you mentioned, one of the ways the mummy can come back is the cult wakes them up, and so if you have these characters of a cult and they're empowered to bring you back because your descent finished, then there's a shortcut to bring them back and keep playing the character.
Exactly.
Going back or more into the cults, actually, mechanically, during character creation, you have to assign background points to determine their power. How abstract is that?
Well, it's interesting. Like a lot of the new WoD games, this is not something we reinvented the wheel on, but we kind of redefined it. Your power trait is tied to the descent. So, unlike a lot of games where your first experience playing the character, so let's say in Vampire, you've just become a vampire, you're a neonate. Fledgling vampires have a power trait of 1, blood potency 1, compared to vampires who've been active and alive or undead for 400 years. They're down there on the power scale overall. Does that stop them from having high traits? No. Doesn't stop them from getting to 5s in their discipline powers, even if they're only a year old. But in terms of the overall power rating, in Mummy, it's flipped. So you awaken at the peak of your overall power. It's like getting to start as Prince. And so like Dave was saying, the classic sort of archetype is tomb robbers come in, mess with stuff, Mummy wakes up and annihilates them all. He's mad and he's the strongest that he will ever be while he's active. That doesn't mean that he's the most effective that he will be. Like, you mentioned he might wake up and say, well, I can put my hand through a steel frame, but I don't even know where I am right now. And then as time goes on, that ebbs, and by the time he's starting to run out, I just need to sleep.
And that's when the hero busts in and takes care of him, and that's why this mummy who could kill 5 guys at the beginning of the movie suddenly gets taken out by 1 guy at the end.
Right. Especially if he's got the right MacGuffin or whatever.
Exactly.
Other questions? Yes.
A couple times you mentioned mummies having programming.
Yes.
What's that about?
Well, it wouldn't really be a horror game if the magic that gave them their existence was entirely beneficent. If you were an ancient, powerful, primitive, early man sorcerer, and you had the ability to spend all these resources so that your culture could create this literally immortal being that sort of served it and your legacy, would you, out of moral compunction, not put any malware into that software? What stops you from doing that? Why does a vampire have all of this stuff that kind of makes him do these things? Well, it's in his nature. It's part of his being. If he could just kind of, have the fangs and run around but not have to worry about sunlight or the hunger or whatever, he wouldn't really be a vampire. And so that game doesn't explicitly state what vampirism was or who created it, but whatever the cause, well, there's obviously a little bit of malicious in there, even if it's just, I want you to learn a lesson. And in Mummy, this is part of the separation of church and state. A lot of the secret history and there's a lot of stuff that mummies don't know about themselves, frankly.
But the storyteller knows.
But the storyteller knows.
Yeah.
So don't read that chapter. If you want to play and you really want to get the most out of it, yeah, it has that little disclaimer. Yes?
Since a fair number of people in the Getty group are going to be non-mummies, they're going to be cultists or mummy ghouls. Do the cultists have any kind of powers like World of Darkness style sorcery, or are they just normal humans?
The game allows for all of the above. If you want to play a regular World of Darkness, blue book dude, you can do that. You've got interesting stories to tell. You don't have phenomenal power, but the whole idea of power, the mummy itself is a walking lesson in it. The guy who you've been revering, who you've never met your entire life, but your whole family is sort of served and everyone's like, it's the sort of secret. He wakes up and you're like, now that's power. And 3 weeks later, he's like an old man. So it's actually a rumination on the nature of power. And so by the time he has to go back to sleep, you're feeling differently about that whole concept. But then there's the fact that, as I said, the idea of living life force and how it sort of translates to magic in the paradigm of the game. Well, cultists are around all of these things. They're around artifacts, basically. Some of them can use them. So the average Joe who's got a skill set and a family and a background is not going to be the same character as one who is part of this weird thing and has been for maybe generations. Oh, and he's also got access to the Shankara stones. So there's elements of that in there. Plus, as I said, certain human beings are gifted with the ability to basically recognize Sekhem and its patterns, move it from one place to another. We call them sorcerers. So there are avenues if you want to not feel like low man on the totem pole when you're playing the game. But part of the entire point of the game is to discourage the thinking that that's the point. Question? Anyone else? Okay, good. Yes.
Did you start by creating a human character, or you follow the normal World of Darkness?
Yes. It's definitely, that's one place we didn't want to get people too confused. So you create a person, like in other storyteller games. This person, though, was what the old version of them, calls the first life. You had to have a personality and a trade 6,000 plus years ago when you were subjected to this. But that's just the start. Then you apply the mummy template, the same as everything else, and the sort of derivative traits of that. Then, here's another thing I'll spoil. There's a third step that you don't find in the other games.
Profit.
One of the things that we talk about in character generation is the idea that your character's life is so long and his memory is a little bit fuzzy, so you don't really have the same kind of prelude that other games do. You don't need to account for every dot on your character sheet, like where you learn to do things, but your storyteller probably will.
And that's another thing. It's a very jumping in medias res kind of feel to the game, because the whole idea of time as a single running narrative, is simultaneously the backdrop and also irrelevant. So the idea of a prelude and this is how you became a vampire, you skip that when you create a mummy character.
So obviously you were speaking before that mummies would make very good antagonists for each other.
Yes.
Obviously because you've got different programming, you've got different people going at each other. But does Mummy have a sort of default antagonist splat in the same vein as, say, Promethean or
yes.
That? And if
there
so,
are like most of the other games, there's a whole internal world consistency. So mummies have their own built-in antagonists. And I will confirm there are. It has its equivalent. I mentioned Belial's Brood for Vampire. Well, there's also Seven in Vampire, which is sort of the other look at what an antagonist vampire could be. It occupies a completely different niche. It has nothing to do with like Satanism or like dark powers or anything. It's just this like in the case of Seven, these are the boogeymen for other vampires and why. Mummy has something similar, and so one of the categories of Mummy sort of specific antagonists are the dark reflection of themselves. part of what separates the arisen from other kinds of mummies is their commitment to being more or less still people and who they were and caring, basically. Well, if you kind of fall to the dark side as a mummy in this game, well, you stop being one of them and you start being something else. And when you be to something else, you really stop liking what you were before, and it becomes very confrontational.
So they still function mostly on the Arisen 10 point, but it's more like the Sentimani from Promethean? Or is it more like your nature itself changes the way it is?
Yeah, it's a pretty dynamic change.
To me, I always felt a bit like the Spectre Wraith change.
Yes, very evocative. I'm a shameless Wraith fan and devotee. It is it's my favorite WAD game from any era. I think Mummy is very evocative of it, and it always has been. In Mummy the Resurrection, there were a lot of these Easter eggs that kind of talked about or alluded to the old continuity and the Wraith tie-in. Plus, mummies are mummies, and so, and because the new game assumes that people and dead people are part of their world, I mean, it's a stereotype. Remember Ghost? All the ghosts want to talk to the medium. It's like, I ain't Gmail for the dead. And so mummies have to deal with a lot of the same stuff, and so there's some tie-in stuff there. We had another question? Yes, over here.
I was wondering, the tasks that the characters have to do, is that developed by the player during character creation, or is that just something that's thrown upon them by the storyteller?
That's a mutual consensus thing. There are storytellers who like to generate their own and kind of, just throw it at their players. And then there are players who say, I'm really into the idea of this, and I'm kind of cool to see where it goes, but if you want some fodder, here's something that's important to my character that I've generated, and the storyteller can use that and work it in. And that can be anything from personal, if you want to go there, think of the love stories that you could tell across thousands of years. Mummies, when they're alive, they like to enjoy it since it doesn't happen with regularity, but it's sort of a metaphor for the experience of living as a person. Role playing, that's the connecting thing. That's how it's accessible, and some of them, shut that part of themselves down. Over here.
Tell us about the cool powers.
Cool powers. Okay. The cool powers are basically drawn along two core lines. You've got things that are sort of more subtle and innate, which, these are some of the benefits worked into the condition of their creation. You wouldn't create this thing and sort of charge it to doing something forever without giving it some tools to work with. These powers are called affinities, and affinities are things that don't necessarily draw too much attention, but they help a mummy kind of be a mummy and do what it has to do. And that's anything from adapting quickly when they wake up to, basically awareness stuff, sensory stuff, things that don't have too big of an overt effect. And then you've got mummy sorcery. And those are reflected in specific self-contained powers called utterances. And utterances are where you get your big, you have just rubbed me the wrong way for the last time. So you see that swarm of beetles? Yeah, run. Desert winds, all the things that you associate with mummies, both from the old games and from the old movies. And if it's kind of got a spectacular overt effect, it's an utterance. They don't have very many of those, since it's in effect kind of stolen secrets. They're not that intuitive, but they're born or made knowing how to do it if they want to apply themselves to it. Anyone else? Good. Yes, one more.
When you mentioned that you like Wraith, and Wraiths, as far as I understand, the idea of Wraith is to find balance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where your character's story ends.
Mm-hmm.
With Mummy, you have a definite timeline, and then, for the most part, the story ends.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the lines are meant for long terms, periods, years in character's life. How would you suggest for storytellers to create games where the players understand that the whole game's going to take place in 6 months or over 2 months. It's not a long-term
Right.
game product.
Well, if you're talking about out of game as something you sit down with your players and say, okay, this game does something a little different, and there's a beginning, middle, and end sort of idea. But that's the case in all games because there has to be something that separates one story from another, one chronicle from another. Generally, you know when you've finished a chronicle, even if the next one you start picks up where you left off with the same characters. And this just does the same thing. It just kind of, it's right on the nose. But you also have to give your players room to be World of Darkness characters. So they don't get to avoid all of those sort of tricky social and emotional situations. You still have a morality trait. Just like vampires, just like people, it still has game impacts. And if your morality is too low relative to other things, it can actually mess up your ability to get anything done because you can't accomplish a lot of the goals that you have to accomplish playing Mummy by sitting in your tomb and hoping that they happen. You have to go out into the world, and it might be a world that you're not that familiar with, and you're going to have to interact with people. Anything else? All right.
Thank you guys very much.
That was a lot of fun.